Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
When my father stood up at the front of the room, glass in hand and that smug, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face, I already knew where this was going. Because I have lived through enough family gatherings to recognize the exact tone he takes when he is about to play to his audience, which in this case happened to be about 40 people crammed into a restaurant private room to celebrate my younger sister's engagement. He started with all the usual fluff about how proud he and Mom were of Emily and Matt, how this was the union they had dreamed of for their daughter, how Matt had fit into our family from the very first day, and how he could not wait to see them build their future together. People were nodding, smiling, clinking their glasses in approval, and I sat there watching it all, because I have learned to wear an expression that hides what I'm actually thinking. But then, right when I thought maybe I could get through the night without being shoved into the role of the punchline, he looked directly at me, tilted his head slightly in that patronizing way he does, and said, "And maybe you'll find someone someday, Rachel." There was a flicker of laughter from a few people who didn't realize how cutting that line was, followed by an awkward silence from those who did, but it didn't matter. Because I had already made the decision about what I was going to say the second the words left his mouth. I smiled, not the fake, polite smile they've seen before, but the one I save for moments when I know I'm in control, and I said, "I already did. And you're not invited." I don't think the silence that followed was just awkward. It was the kind that feels like the oxygen has been pulled out of the room. My father's face froze mid-smirk. My mother's eyes darted from me to the guests like she was calculating how to do damage control without making a scene, and Emily's jaw dropped just enough for me to see that this was not the kind of night she had envisioned. What nobody in that room knew was that this was not a spur-of-the-moment jab or an emotional outburst I would regret later. I had been holding that card in my hand for months, waiting for the exact moment when playing it would land with maximum impact. Because the truth is, I have been in a serious relationship for a long time, and not the kind where we're just casually dating or seeing where things go. We have a life together, one that is very deliberately separate from the circus my family creates whenever there's a milestone to exploit for attention. Daniel and I made the choice early on to keep things quiet, partly because we wanted something that was ours alone, and partly because I wanted to see how far my family's assumptions about me would go if I didn't feed them any information. It started as an experiment, honestly, to see if the version of me they've built in their heads would ever shift without me actively trying to change it. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Instead, the narrative they've clung to for years only got stronger, that I'm too independent, too picky, maybe even too difficult, and that I'll end up alone because of it. It's funny how they frame those same qualities as admirable when they're talking about Emily's career or her strong personality, but when it's me, it becomes a flaw. I stopped trying to correct them a long time ago, partly because I knew it was useless, and partly because I realized there was power in letting people underestimate you. They don't see you coming when you finally decide to make your move. So when I looked my father dead in the eye and told him he wouldn't be invited, I wasn't just responding to a petty dig at my relationship status. I was drawing a line that had been years in the making. I was reminding him, in front of an audience, that I am not the character he has written into the family script, and that my life is not an open stage for him to make jokes on. It felt less like a comeback and more like the opening scene of something much bigger, because the truth is, that night was only step one in a plan I had been quietly putting together for months. Of course, the room didn't see it that way. They just saw a moment of family tension that they would gossip about later, turning it into a story about how Rachel snapped at her sister's engagement party. And I was fine with that, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people will believe the version of events that fits their pre-existing opinion of you until you force them to see something else. And forcing them was exactly what I intended to do. Emily avoided eye contact for the rest of the night, though she kept glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking. My mother tried to smooth things over with small talk, clearly hoping to steer the conversation away from what had just happened, but the tension was still there, hanging in the air between every laugh and every toast. My father said nothing to me after his speech, and that silence was telling, because he's not the kind of man who ignores things unless he's rattled. And he was rattled. I left before dessert was served, not because I felt out of place, but because I wanted to leave them sitting in that discomfort without the chance to corner me and turn it into a private lecture. I could imagine the conversations that would follow, Emily asking if I was serious, my father insisting I was being dramatic, my mother suggesting I must be seeing someone unsuitable if I wouldn't introduce him. They could speculate all they wanted. Every guess they made would only take them further from the truth. What they didn't know, and what I had no intention of telling them that night, was that Daniel and I had already decided on something that would make this little engagement party dust up look like nothing. I had no intention of letting them control the story, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to give them a chance to rewrite my choices into something they could approve of. And as I drove home that night, my phone buzzing with messages I ignored, I realized the real power wasn't just in the words I'd said, it was in knowing that this was only the beginning, and that the next move was mine alone to make. If someone had walked into that engagement party without knowing any of us, they might have thought my father's comment was just an awkward attempt at humor, the kind of clumsy remark a parent makes without realizing how it lands. But for me, it wasn't just about that one night. It was the culmination of years of being cast into the role of the family's afterthought, the one whose accomplishments were quietly acknowledged in private but never celebrated in public, the one whose milestones were always compared against my younger sisters, as if my life was simply a slower, less impressive version of hers. From the time we were teenagers, Emily was the one who got the loud applause, the elaborate parties, the carefully worded praise that made her feel like the sun in our family's small solar system, while I was the one who got the quick nods and the good job muttered in passing, as if my achievements were worth less because they didn't fit the image my parents had decided represented success. I remember graduating from college a year early, something I had worked myself into the ground to achieve, only to have my parents leave the ceremony early because Emily had a sports banquet they didn't want to miss. At the time, I told myself it was fine, that they couldn't be in two places at once, but even then I knew if the roles had been reversed, they would have stayed for every photo, every handshake, every moment. When I bought my first home entirely on my own at 27, I invited them over for dinner to see it, thinking maybe they'd be proud, but my father spent the evening pointing out how the kitchen could have been remodeled better, while my mother spent more time talking about the engagement ring Emily had just been given. Birthdays were similar, a quick dinner, maybe a card, but never the fanfare they put into Emily's celebrations, which always seemed to involve huge gatherings, custom cakes, and speeches about how lucky they were to have her. Over time, I stopped expecting anything different because lowering my expectations was easier than constantly feeling that punch of disappointment. I started keeping parts of my life to myself, not out of spite, but because I realized they didn't care to hear about them unless it somehow involved Emily. And that's why, when I met Daniel, I didn't rush to introduce him to my family. I knew what would happen. They would measure him against Matt, who was already treated like the golden son-in-law, and they would find ways to make Daniel seem not quite right for me. They'd plant little seeds of doubt, couching them in fake concern, and they'd feel entitled to give their opinions on his career, his family, and even how he treated me. I wasn't going to hand them that opportunity. Daniel understood this from the start because he saw through their dynamic almost instantly. We met through work. He was in a different department, but our paths crossed often enough that it was impossible not to notice each other. He was steady, thoughtful, and unlike anyone I'd dated before, he didn't play games or make me feel like I had to earn his attention. Within months, it was obvious this was serious, and by the time we had been together for a year, we were talking about marriage in a very matter-of-fact way, as if it was simply the next logical step for us. But the more serious we became, the more I felt the need to protect what we had from my family's habit of turning everything into a competition or a performance. We made the decision to keep things private not because we were hiding in shame or uncertainty, but because there was something freeing about having a part of my life that was untouched by their influence. Friends knew, his family knew, my closest confidants knew, but my parents and Emily were kept entirely in the dark. I could tell myself it was about avoiding drama, but deep down, I knew there was another reason. I wanted to see how far my family would go in believing their own version of me, the one they had constructed over decades. I wanted to watch them make assumptions and then have the satisfaction of shattering them on my own terms. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I had to sit through endless conversations about how I shouldn't be so picky, or how Emily's so lucky she found Matt so young, or my father's favorite line, "You can't keep waiting for perfection, Rachel." Each time, I bit my tongue, nodded along, and let them believe I was still out there struggling to find someone, when in reality, I was building a life with a man they didn't even know existed. Some might call it deceptive, but I saw it as self-preservation. By the time the engagement party rolled around, the picture they had of me was so outdated it was laughable, and that was exactly what I wanted. I had spent years living in the shadow of Emily's constant spotlight, letting her and my parents define the family narrative while I quietly did my own thing. Now, for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand, because I held the one piece of information that would completely disrupt their version of events. And I wasn't planning to waste it. That night, after I left the party, I sat in my car and thought about all those years, the skip ceremonies, the forgotten birthdays, the backhanded compliments, and I realized that keeping Daniel a secret had done more than protect our relationship. It had given me leverage, a kind of silent control I'd never had before. They thought they knew me so well, but they didn't have the faintest idea what was coming. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I didn't just want to prove them wrong, I wanted to dismantle the entire framework they had built around who I was supposed to be. And I knew the only way to do that was to make sure the reveal happened in a way they couldn't spin, downplay, or claim as part of their support. The plan was already in motion, and after that engagement party toast, I was more certain than ever that they had no idea the trap they were walking into. The morning after the party, I woke up with that prickly mix of adrenaline and calm you get when you have finally stopped asking for permission, and instead of replaying my father's toast on a loop the way I usually would, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold and sketched the next steps like a project plan, not because I wanted to be theatrical or cruel, but because I wanted to break the pattern that had kept me small. And the only way to do that with my family was to make sure every move left them without a handle to grab, without a door to shove open, without any way to retell my story as theirs. I started with the simplest lever I had, which was information, since in my family whoever controls information controls the mood, the narrative, and the pecking order at Sunday dinner. So I made a short list of people who loved to call my mother within an hour of hearing anything interesting, and I did not judge them for it. I used it because you cannot stop a faucet from dripping, but you can decide which sink it fills. I reached out to my Aunt Nora first, because she is warm and messy and loyal and famously incapable of keeping good news to herself, and I told her, casually, that I was thinking of hosting a small brunch next month with a few relatives and close family friends to share something personal, and I wanted to make sure she could make it. I kept my tone light and deliberately vague, the way my mother does when she wants speculation to bloom on its own, and I waited for the inevitable questions that I answered with non-answers, which, in families like mine, are rocket fuel. I sent a similar message to my cousin Jamie, who has a group chat with half the extended family and has screenshot fingers faster than a court stenographer, and to our neighbor from childhood who still attends the same church as my parents and treats gossip as community service. I did not mention Emily, and I did not mention my parents, and I did not mention Daniel by name, because the point was not to declare anything. Yet, the point was to move the center of gravity away from my parents' living room and into a space I controlled, so that when the real moment arrived, the audience would already be looking in my direction. Meanwhile, Daniel and I kept the rest of our life boring and regular on purpose, because nothing makes my parents more suspicious than sudden change, so on paper I went to work, came home, ran errands, and spent weekends catching up on rest, which is a phrase that satisfies mothers and lulls fathers into believing there is nothing to see here, while in reality I was moving pieces around the board with the kind of patience my family has never credited me with. I asked a friend in event planning to hold a soft reservation at a small venue that could seat a modest group without flash. I updated the passport I had been putting off renewing because I wanted zero administrative surprises. And I went to the county office on my lunch break to confirm a timeline for paperwork that will matter later, keeping my phone on airplane mode so my mother's calls would land in voicemail purgatory where they belong. At the same time, I began nudging at the fault lines that already existed in the family dynamic, not to blow them up, but to make sure they were humming with enough tension that any future reveal would land with undeniable weight. When Emily texted me a photo of a floral arrangement she wanted for her engagement photos and asked, in that sweetly barbed way of hers, whether I thought it looked classic or a little out of my league, I replied that it looked expensive and perfect. And then I asked if she had checked whether the date they chose for the shoot conflicted with any big events at the venue, because those places book up fast. I knew she had not checked, and I knew she would immediately call the coordinator, who would tell her there was a charity gala that same evening, which would spiral into a conversation with my mother about timing and crowds and attention, and all I had to do was nothing and let the small panic grow. I also started answering my father differently, which does not sound like strategy, but in our family it is, because he is used to me either defending myself or staying quiet, and both let him feel in charge. When he called 2 days after the party to say he hoped I was not holding a grudge and that his comment was just a nudge to get me out there, I told him I appreciated his concern and that I was doing fine. Then I asked him, very politely, to keep all commentary about my personal life out of public toasts moving forward. He tried to pivot into a half apology with conditions, but I repeated the request and ended the call, and the silence that followed was not anger, it was surprise, which told me I was rewiring the way he expected me to react. Then I sharpened the story I wanted to spread without actually telling it, which is a trick my mother has mastered for years, except this time it was mine. I posted a single photo to a close friends list that did not include my parents or Emily, but did include Nora and Jamie and a handful of people who feed the family pipeline, and the photo was deliberately plain. Just my hand resting on a coffee mug with a slim gold band that could pass as a simple accessory, and the caption said only that I was done keeping secrets that did not protect me. I was careful to turn off public sharing, because I wanted the image to move through whispers, not in a blast, and because I knew Jamie would screenshot it within seconds and send it to the group chat that includes his mother and our church neighbor. And within an hour my phone began to light up with indirect signals that the message had traveled exactly where I wanted it to. The beauty of that tiny act of revenge was that I did not lie, I did not insult anyone, and I did not crash Emily's spotlight. I simply slipped a new focal point into the room and let people walk toward it on their own. Which meant that when my mother finally texted me 2 hours later with a strained, "Is there something you want to tell us before your aunt calls me with her version?" I could answer honestly that I had plans I would share when I was ready, and that I would prefer she not pressure me into rushing, which put her in the rare position of having to wait and watch while the narrative moved without her steering it. By the end of the week the brunch list was quietly full, the venue pencil hold was confirmed for a date that would make sense soon, and Daniel had texted me from a meeting with a message I read 3 times because it made my hands shake in the best way. A simple line that said the paperwork was approved and that the next opening was in 2 weeks if I wanted it, which left me staring at the screen with that same calm adrenaline from the morning after the party and thinking that the only question left was whether I would pull the trigger now or let them sweat a little longer, and as I typed my reply I realized this was not just a plan anymore, it was a countdown. I realized pretty quickly that the most effective way to shift a family that thrives on image is not to argue with them about values or fairness or the way old habits bruise people even when no one means to, but to change what shows up in front of them and in front of the people whose opinions they care about, because in my family reputation is not a lecture, it is a scoreboard. And once you put a new score on the screen, everyone starts recalculating their tone without admitting they are doing it, so I chose one quiet, targeted move that would create noise without me saying a single dramatic word to anyone at home. I accepted an invite to a small charity gala that I knew would be covered by a local blog that loves posting photos of couples on the step and repeat, and I asked Daniel to come with me as my guest, not because I needed to show him off like a trophy, but because I wanted one clean photograph that did not ask for permission and did not apologize, and because I wanted that. First public glimpse to exist outside the context of my parents' house, where every introduction turns into a performance review. We did not dress for attention. We did not pose like a magazine spread. We just showed up on time, signed in, stood where the photographer told us to, smiled like normal people, and then walked inside. And I cannot explain how much peace there is in doing something without the running commentary of what my father will think or how my mother will use it in her next story to relatives, because the moment was ours and also not ours, because we handed it to a system that does not care about our family rules, and that was the point. And 30 hours later a friend sent me a link where our photo sat in the middle of a collage with a caption that used both our names correctly. I did not send the link to anyone in my family, because I did not need to, as half of my mother's world lives for that blog and my aunt lives for forwarding it. And by mid-morning my phone started vibrating with messages that were somehow both shocked and nosy and upbeat, and I answered none of them, because the most strategic thing I could do at that exact moment was let the image do the work while I kept my mouth shut. By noon my mother called and skipped hello, which she only does when she feels she has lost control of a narrative and wants to grab it back fast, and she said she was confused and concerned and hurt that I would announce something so personal on a public site before telling my parents, which made me laugh a small laugh I did not mean to let out, and I told her it was a charity page, not a press release, and that I had not announced anything. I had simply attended an event like an adult who is allowed to go places without asking for family clearance, and she went quiet for a long second before pivoting to the line she uses when she wants me to feel like the ungrateful child, which is that she only wants to be included. And I said she will be included when inclusion does not mean interrogation, and she said I was being dramatic, and I said I was being clear, and then I ended the call because clarity does not require a panel discussion. Emily, to her credit, tried a different angle later that afternoon, which was a text that sounded supportive but was basically reconnaissance, asking how long we had been seeing each other and whether Daniel was serious. And I told her that I talk about serious things when I feel safe, which made her switch to a wounded tone about how my secrecy was overshadowing her engagement and that people were asking her whether my relationship would change the wedding timeline. As if she had a patent on milestones and I was violating it, and I replied that other people's questions are not my responsibility and that her engagement will stand on its own if it is about her and not about how small I am willing to make myself to keep it shiny. She went quiet after that, which I took as a sign that the seed of doubt I planted earlier had found water, and I did not feel guilty, because all I had done was refuse to play the understudy in a role I never auditioned for. That week, Daniel and I met after work at the same small coffee place we always use when we need to talk without distractions, and he slid a folder across the table with simple documents that were the opposite of dramatic and exactly what I wanted. Because there is a very particular kind of power in paperwork that does not ask for an audience, and inside was the confirmation that the earliest opening for a civil ceremony with a judge we trusted was in less than 2 weeks, and that the process would be clean if we moved quickly, and that we could have 2 witnesses and keep it quiet if we chose. He said we could wait if I needed more time, but the relief I felt reading those lines was so strong I almost started laughing from the stupid joy of it. Because finally the decision was ours and not a debate topic on a group text. I told him I wanted the earliest date, I wanted it small, and I wanted to decide who stood there with us based on who had earned that space in our life, not based on blood or obligation, and I wanted to know that the next time my father told a room that I was alone, the truth would already be on my finger and in my chest and not in his approval, and Daniel looked at me like he had been waiting to hear exactly that. And he nodded, and it was done. I still had one more piece to set in place before the day came, because I needed to guarantee that the reveal would land where it should, not in my parents' living room where they could recast it as their gracious acceptance, but in a setting they cared about, with people they could not brush off, and the opportunity arrived on its own in the form of a family dinner my mother announced for later that month to celebrate a new round of engagement photos that had finally been scheduled after some unexpected venue conflicts, which made me smile because I knew exactly why they had those conflicts and I had no intention of apologizing for making Emily look twice at the calendar. I told my mother that of course I would be there and that I would be bringing a guest, and she said she would set an extra place and could I please share a last name for the place card. And I said she could leave the card blank because I had something to share that would make labels unnecessary. In the days that followed, I booked the judge. I asked my closest friend to be a witness. I told Nora to keep the brunch on hold because the theme was changing. And I went quiet on social media again so the line would stay taut and the chatter would keep building in exactly the wrong directions. And on a Tuesday afternoon in a room with no flowers and no speeches and no forced toasts, Daniel and I said private vows that felt like an anchor after years of performing calm in a house that rewarded anything but, and when the little gold band was on my hand for real, I felt an almost physical click, like a door finally shutting on a hallway I had been stuck in since I was a teenager. We stepped out into the ordinary noise of the city and grabbed takeout and went home, and we did not post a photo and we did not call my parents, because the point was not to hide. The point was to decide the order of things, and the order was vows first. Then the truth, then the reaction, and never again the other way around. 2 days later, my father texted a reminder about the family dinner with a note that he would be doing a short toast to thank everyone for supporting Emily and Matt through the busy season. And he hoped there would be no surprises this time because he wanted a calm night for once. And I stared at the message for a long minute because there are moments where you can either deflate and make the world small again, or you can keep the line you set. And I typed back that I was looking forward to it, and that I would say a few words after his toast if the room could spare a minute, and he wrote back a thumbs up and a smile that I could feel through the text even though there were no little pictures on my screen. And I put the phone down and looked at my ring and felt the countdown reach the last numbers, because everything was in place and the only thing left was to walk into that room and let the truth do what it does when it is finally louder than their version. And right then my phone buzzed once more with an email notification that the certificate had been filed and processed and the record was official, which meant there was nothing they could argue with even if they wanted to, and I realized that the next time my father raised a glass, the person he thought he could make small would be the one finishing the night, and that was the point where I stopped feeling nervous and started feeling ready. The night of the family dinner, I walked in a few minutes early because I wanted to make sure the one detail that actually mattered was set, not the flowers or the place cards or the playlist my mother always micromanages, but the simple agreement I had with the manager that when I signaled, he would bring one envelope to the table with the words paid in full stamped across a printed receipt under my new name. And he nodded the way people nod when they know a tiny action is going to carry a lot of weight, so I took a breath, thanked him, and went in my seat where the card my mother had left blank was waiting like an old habit that did not know it was about to be retired. My parents arrived exactly on time, Emily and Matt a few minutes later with the bright smiles people put on when they are trying to pretend a storm is not brewing. And the room filled with relatives and neighbors and the kind of friends who have opinions about everything, and when everyone settled, my father stood, raised his glass, and delivered a shorter version of his usual speech about being proud and grateful and excited for the future, carefully avoiding jokes about me because I had already told him I wouldn't tolerate it, which meant he was working hard to look generous while still staying in charge, and when he sat down and the clinking stopped, I stood and asked for 1 minute. I said I would keep it quick because celebrations should stay on track, but I needed to correct a line that had been repeated in this family for years, and I wanted to do it with the same volume it had always been said with, which is out loud and in front of everyone. And the table went quiet in that way it does when people want drama they can pretend to disapprove of later, and I looked at my father, then at my mother, then at Emily, and I said that a few weeks ago at the engagement party, there was a comment about me finding someone someday, and I had replied that I already had and that they would not be invited, and I was here to follow through on that, not out of spite and not to steal anyone's night, but because I am done letting other people narrate my life like I am a cautionary example that only makes sense when compared to my sister. Then I turned to Daniel, who had been sitting quietly beside me in that steady way of his, and I said I wanted everyone to meet my husband, and he stood up, shook my father's hand before my father could decide whether to stand or sit or pretend he knew this already, and it was done, not dramatic, not embellished, just final. There was a beat where the room did not know whether to clap or gasp or start whispering under the table, and I did not give them long, because I wanted the next sentence to land before the old reflexes took over. So I said we had chosen to get married in a small civil ceremony a few days earlier because we wanted vows before opinions, and because we wanted to start our marriage without commentary disguised as care, and because we wanted the people present to be the ones who had shown up for us without demanding a vote, and that meant my parents were not there, and Emily and Matt were not there, and it was not a punishment, it was an answer to a pattern I had asked them to stop for years. My mother opened her mouth and then closed it, and Emily stared the way people stare when they feel a spotlight sliding away from them, and they do not know if it will come back. And my father started to speak in that calm tone he uses when he is about to flip a situation into a lecture, so I moved. Before he could and said, I wanted to make something crystal clear, which was that I was not asking anyone to approve, I was informing them, and going forward there would be 3 rules if they wanted to be part of our life, and none of them were up for debate. I said the first rule was that there would be no more jokes about my choices or my timeline at public events, because there is nothing funny about being turned into a family punchline and calling it love. The second rule was that comparisons between me and Emily would stop completely, because if they want to celebrate her they can do it without needing me to play the smaller role as set dressing. And the third rule was that access to my life would depend on how they treat my boundaries, which is not rude or dramatic or controlling, it is adult, and if they violated those rules there would be timeouts that lasted as long as necessary, and I did not mean dramatic exits. I meant quiet blocks and missing invitations and unanswered calls until the point landed. I said all of this without raising my voice and without anger, and I watched the room do the math in real time, because when a woman stops playing the reasonable daughter and starts speaking like the owner of her life, people either recalibrate or reveal themselves, and either way you win. Then I nodded to the manager, who brought the envelope just as planned and placed it in front of my father, and I told him the dinner was already covered by me and by my husband as a congratulations to Emily and Matt, and as a thank you to everyone who came out tonight, and also as a small correction to a long habit where I was made to feel like the guest at my own family table, because paying the bill is not a flex. It is a line in the sand about who is actually hosting the story, and he looked down at the receipt and paused on the name, because there it was in clean black letters, not a threat, not a plea, just a fact my father could not argue with, Mrs. followed by my new last name, and then my own, and that was the moment the oxygen changed. My mother finally got words out and asked, in a small voice that I have not heard since I was a kid, why we had not trusted them with this, and I answered the only honest way I could, which was that I had trusted them many times and every time. The trust turned into a review, and I was done with reviews. I wanted respect, and respect starts with quiet. We sat, the room exhaled. People clapped in that uncertain way crowds clap when they are catching up to a new reality. Emily went to the restroom and stayed a long time. Matt gave Daniel a professional nod that told me he is at least capable of focusing on the right part of a moment, and my father said nothing at all, which for him is the loudest admission I am ever going to get. We ate, and the conversation slowly returned to safe topics, and no one dared make a joke at my expense, and when the plates were cleared I stood again for one last sentence, because I wanted to leave no room for edits. And I said there would be a small reception next month with people who had shown up for me without asking for a role, and I hoped to see anyone there who could follow the 3 rules without needing to be reminded. And I thanked everyone for coming tonight to celebrate Emily, and then I sat down and took Daniel's hand under the table. On the drive home, I felt that strange mixture that comes when you win and also lose something you thought you needed, because I knew we had crossed a line, and there was no going back to the older version of our family where I kept trying to fit a shape that never matched my edges. And I also knew there would be fallout in phone calls and side comments, and probably a few dramatic retellings that make me sound colder than I am. But none of that mattered, because the core was settled, the record was official. The bill was paid, the name was said out loud, and the rules were on the table, and for the first time in years I did not feel like I had to brace for the aftershocks. I only had to decide who would be invited to the life I am actually living. Whether my father ever apologizes, or my mother ever admits the favoritism, or Emily ever stops treating everything as a stage is a question I can carry without letting it bend my spine, because the final move was mine and it was clean and even. If part of me wonders how they will tell this story tomorrow, the part that matters knows exactly how tonight ended, which is simple and undeniable and, if we are being honest, pretty damn satisfying.